In the Middle Ages, war was never just a contest of swords and armor, even if that's how the stories often present it. Behind the heroic charges and glittering banners, there was a constant risk that had nothing to do with the enemy's skill: the danger of a single miscalculation. Again and again, commanders marched their men into situations where the real enemy wasn't the rival army at all, but the land beneath their feet, the food that failed to arrive, or the impatience that pushed them into hopeless assaults. It was this repeated error, ignoring the harsh realities of survival and preparation, that silently claimed more lives than any knight's blade ever could. Number 1. The cost of overconfidence. The central error that turned medieval battlefields into graveyards was leadership faith in the unstoppable shock of heavy cavalry, even as conditions, weapons, and formations made that confidence misplaced. Knightly charges, spectacular to watch and prestigious for elites, depended on open ground, momentum, and opponents willing to stand in the worst possible place. Once archers, disciplined infantry, and simple field obstacles disrupted that recipe, armored riders lost their edge, and thousands paid for commanders' refusal to adapt. At Crécy in 1346, English deployment made the difference. Dismounted men-at-arms anchored the center, longbow contingents on the wings dominated approaches, and repeated French rushes broke into chaos under arrow storms and crowding. The point is not just longbows killed knights, but that French leadership kept renewing frontal assaults into a compact defensive layout designed to neutralize cavalry advantages. Agincourt in 1415 showed the same pattern under harsher terrain constraints. A narrowed, recently ploughed and rain-soaked field channeled numerically superior French formations into a confined, muddy lane, while English archers, protected by angled stakes, dictated tempo. Horses were particularly vulnerable to high arc volleys striking flanks and rumps, and when the first wave stalled, sheer mass crushed men in back armor that had become a burden in deep mud. Earlier warnings existed. At Courtrai, the Golden Spurs, 1302, Flemish militias on foot, backed by good ground and discipline, shattered French chivalry. At Bannockburn, 1314, Scottish schiltrons, dense spear hedgehogs, blunted, and then broke English mounted attacks, aided by pits and prepared positions. Across these cases, the common thread was decision-making. Overconfidence locked leaders into honor-coded tactics that ignored ground, failed to coordinate combined arms, and underestimated infantry staying power. Technical factors mattered, but not deterministically. Longbows were formidable at effective ranges in massed fire, and could penetrate, or at least compromise vulnerable points and unarmored horses, yet their battlefield impact always depended on placement, ammunition supply, and protection by stakes or men-at-arms. Pikemen and other polearm troops likewise punished cavalry when commanders forced charges against prepared points of resistance. Even logistics fed into arrogance. Belief that prestige alone would carry a day encouraged hurried engagements on poor terrain after fatiguing marches, reducing cavalry performance and magnifying small tactical errors into catastrophes. The one mistake, then, was a mindset and elite habit of treating chivalric shock as a universal solution. Once rivals combined terrain choice, missile fire, and compact infantry blocks, that habit met its limits, and persistence in it, rather than flexible planning, turned celebrated charges into mass casualties. Number 2. The trap of the siege. Medieval warfare turned deadliest when commanders believed stone walls could be broken faster than hunger could break men, and that single decision choosing a siege without the patience, supplies, sanitation, or seasonal timing to sustain it reliably bled armies dry. A fortress existed to multiply time. Thick curtains, towers with overlapping fields of fire, and protected wells bought weeks or months for defenders, while attackers burned through food, timber, and morale. The arithmetic was cruel. Every day in the lines demanded grain for humans, fodder for horses, fuel for kitchens, timber for engines and palisades, and coin for pay. Failure on any one of those inputs pushed a besieger toward disease, desertion, and mutiny long before a breach appeared. The classic case is Acre in 1189 and 1191, where both sides' access to the sea prolonged the grind and turned the battlefield into a sanitation disaster. Camps swelled with reinforcements faster than latrines, bakehouses, and hospitals could be arranged, and the besiegers' initial confidence dissolved into rationing and squalor until naval control and coordinated assaults finally tipped the balance. Antioch earlier in the First Crusade exposed the same weakness from the opposite angle. An army that ringed a city without secure hinterlands soon found foraging parties ambushed, pack animals consumed, and morale throttled. When relief forces appeared, besiegers risked becoming the besieged, revealing how thin their logistics truly were. The technology of siegecraft rarely failed on its own. Trebuchets hurled stones, mantlets crept forward, miners collapsed towers. But the ecosystem around those tools decided outcomes. Wood for engine frames, iron for fittings, rope and hide for slings, trained engineers to aim and maintain them, and disciplined labor to rotate shifts under fire. Simple engineering choices mattered. Contravallation lines facing outward to blunt relief armies, and circumvallation lines facing inward to choke the city. Commanders who skipped one of these to save time invited catastrophe when a relieving field force arrived, or when sorties cut supply routes. Water defined health. Encircling troops often camped near streams fouled by upstream camps or by the city's waste, turning dysentery and typhus into routine killers. Poorly sited latrines, slaughter pits, and horse lines ensured that every rainstorm washed pathogens through the trenches. Weather amplified mistakes. Winter sieges required fuel at scale and adequate shelter to keep men functional. Summer heat made rot and flies the constant enemy of meat, bandages, and morale. Leadership culture added friction. Noble contingents operated as semi-autonomous corporations with their own priorities. Divergent calendars of piety, pay cycles, and harvest obligations made multi-month coordination fragile. Prestige drove premature assaults meant to prove resolve, scattering ladders and men under arrow fire and boiling liquids, while the real decisive lever starving the defenders while staying healthy received fewer resources than the next grand engine or bannered display. Even successful operations carried hidden costs. Henry the Fiver's investment of Harfleur won a port, but infected an army. Dysentery carved the ranks before any decisive field battle, illustrating that a siege could purchase strategic position while bankrupting combat power. The one persistent error was mistaking presence for pressure, surrounding a city without the slow, unglamorous work of building magazines, enforcing hygiene, securing naval or river control, constructing double lines, and planning seasonal relief schedules. Defenders understood that every day a besieger failed to feed and pay troops was a day closer to negotiation on favorable terms or to a relief army's arrival. Practical commanders measured sieges like accountants' calorie inflows, fodder tonnage, timber quotas, cart availability, engineer headcount, because the physics of attrition punished optimism. When leaders ignored that ledger, the trenches filled not with heroes cut down in storming columns, but with the sick, the starving, and the exhausted who never reached the walls. Number 3. When terrain became the executioner. Medieval commanders who treated the map like a backdrop rather than a weapon turned the ground itself into the most efficient killer, because soil, slope, water, and vegetation dictated speed, cohesion, and fatigue more ruthlessly than any opposing general. Heavy cavalry depended on momentum and formation integrity. Mud and ruts bled that momentum away, narrowed files, and magnified small halts into pileups, where rear ranks crushed the breath out of front ranks. At Agincourt in 1415, the field was recently ploughed and rain-sodden, fenced by woods that funneled movement. The result was a forced shoulder-to-shoulder advance, in which plate harness that normally spread impact instead trapped heat and weight, while arrow storms targeted unarmored horses and joints, turning the first stumble into a mass stall that no banner could untangle. The same mechanical logic appears across Europe when leaders ignored choke points and water obstacles. At Stirling Bridge in 1297, a confined crossing let a smaller Scottish force destroy English contingents piecemeal as they trickled over. The bridge, not the blade, set the casualty curve. At Courtrai in 1302, low-lying ditch-sliced meadows neutralized French charges against dense Flemish infantry, whose pikes and Godendags needed only steadiness and firm footing to win. Forested passes could be worse. At Morgarten in 1315, Swiss infantry used a lakeside road hemmed by slope and bog to catch Austrian knights strung out, where a downhill shock from polearms and rocks broke the column before it could deploy. Winter and water made their own traps. On frozen lakes, as at the Baltic showdowns remembered for Lake Peipus, thin or rough ice punished rapid maneuvers and sapped horse confidence, so the advantage shifted to compact infantry, willing to hold ground while riders hesitated. Rivers and tides added timing risk. Misreading a tidal flat or ford depth turned an orderly crossing into an equipment-drowning boot-sucking morass, and once standards stalled midstream, missile fire and panic completed the job. Even gentle slopes mattered. Archers and crossbowmen on slight rises extended their killing zones because shots arrived steeper and shields protected less. Conversely, downhill charges that looked glorious often ended in shattered cohesion when horses met unseen rills or cart tracks at speed. Commanders who did not pace, marches to the ground arrived dehydrated, blistered and out of breath, then fed men into contact before the baggage caught up. A tired formation on poor footing loses its shield overlap and pike angle first, which is exactly when disciplined defenders step in. Simple fieldworks multiplied terrain effects. Angled stakes, ditches and hedges forced cavalry to drift sideways into soft patches, while contrived bottlenecks gaps between woods, village fences or vineyard walls let fewer defenders touch more attackers at once. Weather was the amplifier. Rain turned chalk and clay into glue. Heat inside mail and plate drained stamina. Cold stiffened bowstrings and numbed fingers. The recurring mistake was assuming honor codes and unit reputations overruled physics. Armies that read ground like an engineer checking bearing capacity of soil, width of deployment corridors, depth to water table, wind direction for smoke, sun angle for visibility survived. Armies that didn't discover too late that the field had already chosen the winner. Number 4. The forgotten role of supply. Medieval campaigns rose or fell on bread, water, fodder and time, and the recurring mistake that killed most armies was treating logistics as an afterthought to valor and tactics. A field force was not just armored men and bright standards. It was a moving city with ovens, herds, wagons, grooms, farriers and surgeons, all consuming resources at a pace local landscapes could not sustain for long. A commander who crossed a frontier without magazines, river control, or firm credit found the army shrinking each day through hunger, disease, and desertion, long before steel met steel. Forage-limited strategy, horses needed reliable pasture and grain, yet chevauché tactics, and scorched earth stripped regions bare, forcing lengthening supply lines that slowed operations and exposed convoys to ambush. Camp density magnified sickness when latrines, slaughter pits, and refuse were sited badly. Summer heat and standing water bred dysentery and typhoid, while winter sieges demanded vast timber for fuel and shelters just to keep men functional. The most successful leaders treated logistics like engineering, synchronizing river barges, coastal shipping, and wagon trains with March calendars and harvest cycles, because feudal obligations alone could not keep troops in the field once the 40-day service window closed. Cash pay and contracted victuals were necessary to hold formations together beyond that horizon. Failures recur across theaters. The 1197 German Crusade stalled under disease and provisioning shortfalls before decisive contact, a pattern already visible at Antioch in 1097-98 when besiegers ringed a city they could not feed, and almost became the besieged when relief armies arrived. At Acre, 1189-1191, access to the sea extended the struggle, but also swelled camps faster than bakeries. Wells and hospitals could be built, turning the siege into an attritional contest won as much by maritime supply and sanitation improvisation as by engines and assaults. In France, Harfleur 1415 demonstrated how a successful siege could hollow out an army. Dysentery ravaged Henry V's ranks after weeks in malarial marshlands, proving that a port captured at the cost of fighting fitness could set up catastrophe in the next engagement. In Egypt, Louis IX discovered that victory at Damietta meant little without secure movement along the Nile. Shifting currents, heat, and overextended depots culminated in Mansoura and Feriskour, with sickness, supply collapse, and capture. Even inland, royal hosts in Iberia learned that fast-moving raids outran their carts and waterskins on the Meseta, while Christian and Muslim commanders who tied operations to cereal harvests and mule availability preserved their striking power. The practical checklist was unforgiving. Bakehouses established early, grain milled and rationed. Wine, ale, or boiled water prioritized to limit waterborne illness. Fodder pre-positioned. Draft animals rotated. River fords and bridges secured. Wagon axles, shoes, and harness repaired on schedule. Engineers and carpenters assigned before engines were needed, and contracts with merchants to bridge shortages. Where leaders ignored that ledger, the battlefield decision had already been made. Starving men fought poorly, sick men did not march, and unpaid men drifted away. The single era-confusing courage with capacity turned ambition into attrition, and the attrition into graves. Number 5. Lessons written in blood. The single mistake that cut down medieval armies at scale was treating war as a contest of courage and shock rather than a system with unforgiving inputs. Food, water, animals, time, ground, and information. So decision-makers kept privileging prestige maneuvers over the dull arithmetic that actually kept formations alive. The durable pattern across campaigns shows that where leaders integrated logistics, terrain, timing, intelligence, and disciplined combined arms, casualty curves stayed manageable. Where they insisted on honor-coded charges or hurried sieges without infrastructure, losses mounted before contact. Supply sat at the center of every outcome. Grain for men, fodder for horses, fuel for ovens and forges, spare shoes and axles for wagons, and coin to extend feudal service past the 40-day window. Armies that pre-positioned magazines along rivers, synchronized wagon trains with barges and coastal shipping, and rationed bread and ale according to march tempo preserved combat power. Hosts that crossed frontiers on hope discovered that hunger, disease, and desertion did more damage than enemy steel. Terrain converted small planning errors into disasters. Cavalry shock demanded width, firmness of soil, and clean approaches. Rain on clay, hedged lanes, ditches, or soft ploughland robbed momentum and collapsed files into crush points where rear ranks suffocated the front. Infantry that understood slope and footing pikes set on firm ground. Archers behind stakes on a rise. Men-at-arms dismounted to anchor a line-blunted charges that looked invincible on paper. Water obstacles, bridges, and fords defined initiative. Commanders who secured crossings with advance parties, built pontoon alternates, and guarded banks with missiles kept freedom of movement. Those who pushed masses into narrow passages invited piecemeal defeat. Sieges exposed the same habit of mind. A ring around a city was not pressure unless backed by contravallation and circumvallation lines, bakehouses, wells, and consistent convoy protection. Otherwise, camps became disease engines, relief forces cut communication, and besiegers turned into the besieged. Sanitation was strategy by other means, camp layout with draft and sink latrines downstream, carcass pits, drainage ditches, and regulated water points reduced dysentery and typhoid. Neglect of those basics erased units faster than arrows. Time punished vanity. Winter demanded fuel tonnage and shelter carpentry. Summer required water discipline, shade for animals, and rest cycles. March calendars tied to harvests and mule availability mattered more than banners. Intelligence and reconnaissance separated professionals from gamblers. Scouts measuring bank heights, soil-bearing capacity, ford depths, and enemy picket habits delivered options. Leaders who skipped those reports because the field will decide discovered the field had already decided. Organization translated plans into endurance. Mixed contingents, feudal levies, mercenaries, urban militias needed a common pay rhythm, clear command ladders, and work details for engineers, carpenters, and smiths, so engines, bridges, and carts existed when required. Even weapon revolutions only worked as part of that system. Masked longbows, crossbows, and later handguns produced decisive effects because ammunition, bowstaves, strings, and pavises were stocked, because stakes or wagon lagers protected crews, and because infantry and men-at-arms absorbed shocks once missiles had disordered attacks. Naval and river control multiplied land strength. Sieges with sea lanes lasted or failed according to hull count, victual crates, and the ability to keep mills grinding. Finance underwrote everything. Credit from townsmen and Italian bankers extended campaigns beyond feudal limits, but missed payments fragmented coalitions at exactly the moment concentration was needed. The recurring error was refusing to treat these variables as co-equal to bravery. Plans that began with a terrain choice, a ration schedule, a water map, a march rate, and a reserve echelon produced fewer dead than plans that began with a charge. Where generals built systems double lines around fortresses, road repairs ahead of baggage, timed relief against expected enemy movements, disciplined camp hygiene, and steady pay armies stayed coherent and lethal. Where they trusted reputation and impetus, the soil, weather, and calendar enforced their own verdict and wrote it in casualties.